The courtroom felt strangely calm, almost too calm for a place where a marriage was about to end. It wasn't the kind of silence filled with grief or tension. It was the kind that comes when one side believes they have already won. Michael Hayes sat confidently at the polished wooden table, dressed in a tailored charcoal suit, his posture relaxed, his expression faintly amused. To him, this divorce hearing was nothing more than a tedious formality, something to get through before returning to what he considered his real life. The divorce papers lay neatly stacked in front of him. A pen rested on top, waiting. Michael glanced at the documents and smirked, as if they were beneath him. He had signed contracts worth millions before. This was nothing. Just another signature, another loose end tied up. Across the room stood Emily Hayes, his wife, at least for a few more minutes. She looked ordinary, painfully ordinary. A simple dress, no jewelry, her hair pulled back neatly. She wasn't crying. She wasn't arguing. She wasn't even trying to defend herself. She simply stood there quietly, hands folded in front of her, eyes lowered. To Michael, that silence confirmed everything he already believed about her. She had always been like this, passive, unremarkable, easy to overlook. The judge entered, and everyone in the room rose. When they sat again, the judge adjusted his glasses and looked down at the file. His voice was steady, professional, detached. "Mr. Hayes," the judge said, "you understand the terms of this divorce?" Michael answered immediately, "Yes, Your Honor, completely." There was no hesitation in his voice. No doubt, no sadness. In fact, there was something close to relief. The judge nodded and glanced at Emily. "Mrs. Hayes?" Emily lifted her head slightly. Her face was calm, almost unreadable. "Yes, Your Honor." Michael leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms. He glanced at her briefly, then looked away, as if she no longer required his attention. In his mind, this was already over. Moments later, the discussion turned to assets. Michael cleared his throat and spoke again, confident, almost dismissive. "There are no shared assets to divide. Everything of value was acquired through my income. My wife doesn't own anything substantial." The words hung in the air. A few people in the courtroom exchanged glances. Someone in the back shifted uncomfortably, but Michael didn't notice, or didn't care. He felt justified. To him, he was simply stating facts. The judge looked at Emily once more. "Do you contest this statement?" Emily paused for a brief moment, just long enough to make the silence noticeable. Then she said, "No, Your Honor." Michael almost laughed. He shook his head slightly, as if amused by how predictable the situation was. In his mind, Emily agreeing only proved what he had always thought, that she knew her place, that she understood she had nothing to stand on. He picked up the pen. But before signing, he stopped. Slowly, deliberately, he looked up at her. "No hard feelings," he said casually, his tone almost kind on the surface, but sharp underneath. "This is probably for the best. You'll manage. You always do." It wasn't concern. It wasn't sympathy. It was condescension. Emily didn't respond. She didn't react. She didn't even look hurt. She simply nodded once. That unsettled someone in the room, though not Michael. To him, her silence meant defeat. He leaned forward and signed the papers. The pen scratched against the paper, slow and deliberate. One signature, then another. Michael Hayes completed the process with the same indifference he might have shown signing a receipt. When he finished, he slid the documents forward, a satisfied smile still on his face. In that moment, Michael believed he had closed a chapter. He believed he had walked away clean, untouched, unburdened. What he didn't know, what he couldn't know yet, was that he had just signed away something far greater than a marriage. The judge accepted the papers and began reviewing them carefully, page by page, line by line. Michael leaned back again, stretching slightly, already mentally planning the rest of his day. Lunch with colleagues, maybe drinks later. He imagined telling the story, embellishing it with humor. She didn't even fight, he would say. Didn't ask for a thing. To him, that was proof of his superiority, proof that he had chosen right by ending it. Emily remained standing, composed, patient. She wasn't nervous, she wasn't relieved. It was almost as if she were waiting, not for the divorce to end, but for something else to begin. The courtroom atmosphere subtly shifted. It was nothing obvious, no raised voices, no sudden movement, just a quiet tension creeping in, like the pressure before a storm. The judge paused. Michael noticed it but dismissed it. Judges paused all the time. Procedures, formalities. He had no idea that the next few moments would dismantle everything he believed about his wife, about himself, and about the reality he thought he controlled. To Michael Hayes, this was the end of a forgettable marriage. In truth, it was the beginning of a reckoning he was completely unprepared for. 7 years earlier, Michael Hayes had believed he was making a sensible choice. Emily wasn't the kind of woman who turned heads when she entered a room, but she was calm, intelligent, and uncomplicated, or so he thought. At the time, Michael was climbing fast in his career. Long hours, aggressive goals, constant competition. Emily fit neatly into his life because she didn't demand much from it. She didn't push for luxury vacations, didn't pressure him about money, didn't compete for attention. To Michael, that felt like peace. They met through mutual friends at a quiet dinner party, while others talked loudly about promotions, investments, and ambition. Emily listened more than she spoke. When she did speak, it was thoughtful, measured. Michael liked that. He mistook her restraint for simplicity and her humility for lack of depth. On their third date, Michael talked for nearly 2 hours about his plans, where he wanted to be in 5 years, the kind of lifestyle he expected, the respect he believed he deserved. Emily listened without interruption. At the end, she smiled and said, "That sounds important to you." Michael took that as support. He never thought to ask what mattered to her. Emily had grown up learning how to disappear in plain sight. Wealth had surrounded her since birth, but not in the way people imagined. There were no flashy mansions or paparazzi moments. Her father, Robert Sinclair, had raised her with one rule above all others: privacy was protection. His empire didn't exist on magazine covers or public stock markets. It lived behind trusts, shell companies, and quiet boardrooms where names were never spoken aloud. Learned early that money changed people, and not for the better, so she chose distance from it. When Michael proposed, he did so confidently, almost pragmatically. Marriage felt like the next logical step. Emily accepted without hesitation, not because she was swept away, but because she believed, perhaps naively, that Michael loved her for who she was, not what she could offer. In the early years, things worked. Michael was busy, often exhausted, and Emily adapted. She took care of the home, supported him when deals fell through, celebrated his promotions quietly. She never corrected him when he assumed she relied on his income. She never mentioned the accounts she had never touched, the inheritance she had never claimed, the trust that quietly grew year after year in her name. Over time, Michael's success became his identity. He started measuring everything, and everyone, by visible outcomes: titles, salaries, influence. Emily didn't fit into those categories, at least not ones he respected. When his colleagues brought spouses to company events, dressed in designer clothes and speaking in polished corporate language, Michael noticed the difference. He began to feel that Emily made him look smaller. He never said it outright at first. It started with subtle remarks, suggestions that she should do more, questions about whether she wanted to be someone. Each comment carried an assumption, that she was behind him, dependent on him, fortunate to be there. Emily heard it all. She absorbed it quietly. She tried explaining once that value wasn't always loud, that ambition could exist without performance. Michael brushed it off. To him, that sounded like excuses. The arguments grew sharper. Michael complained that he carried all the weight. Emily didn't contribute financially, didn't understand his world, didn't push herself. He never asked why she chose a simpler life. He never considered that it might be intentional. When the word divorce first surfaced, Michael said it casually, during an argument about nothing significant. Emily went silent. That silence, once comforting to him, now irritated him. He interpreted it as weakness. He mistook her lack of resistance for lack of power. From that moment on, Michael rewrote their history in his mind. He convinced himself he had outgrown her, that she had benefited from him more than he had from her, that ending the marriage was not only justified but necessary. Emily didn't fight the decision. She didn't beg. She didn't negotiate. She asked only one question: "Are you sure?" Michael answered yes without hesitation. The legal process moved quickly. Michael's lawyers were efficient, confident. They saw a straightforward case: a high-earning husband, a wife with no visible assets, no claims, no complications. Emily's attorney asked very few questions. He reviewed documents, made notes, and said little. Michael found that amusing. He took it as further confirmation that there was nothing to uncover. What Michael never noticed was how carefully Emily reviewed every document before signing anything, how she asked specific questions about wording, about finality, about irrevocable decisions. Not once did she mention money. Not once did she hint at what she was leaving behind. To Michael, the imbalance felt satisfying. It reinforced his belief that he was in control, that he was the one with leverage, that he was the one walking away clean. But beneath that our face story, another truth existed, one Michael never bothered to look for. Emily wasn't avoiding conflict because she was powerless. She was choosing timing. She wasn't losing anything in that courtroom. She had already chosen what she valued, and it wasn't something the law could divide. By the time the divorce hearing arrived, Michael felt victorious. Emily felt resolved. They walked into the same courtroom carrying entirely different realities, shaped by entirely different assumptions. Michael believed he was closing a chapter where he had given more than he received. Emily knew she was closing a door that no longer needed to be open, and neither of them, especially Michael, fully understood what would happen when those two realities finally collided. The divorce proceedings moved forward with an efficiency that only strengthened Michael's sense of superiority. Each procedural step felt like confirmation that this case was exactly what he believed it to be: simple, predictable, and completely in his favor. He answered questions with ease, spoke clearly, and never once faltered. To anyone watching, he looked like a man firmly in control of his life. Emily, on the other hand, remained quiet. She responded when spoken to, but never added more than necessary. She didn't interrupt. She didn't challenge Michael's statements. That silence became a canvas onto which everyone else projected their assumptions. To Michael, it was proof that she had nothing to say because she had no thing to defend. When the judge asked about spousal support, Michael let out a short laugh before catching himself. "Your Honor, I don't believe that will be necessary. My wife never expressed interest in financial independence, and I've already supported her generously throughout the marriage." The word generously lingered in the air, heavy with implication. Emily's attorney didn't object. He simply nodded once, as if acknowledging a technicality. That reaction emboldened Michael further. He straightened in his chair, his confidence growing with each unanswered statement. It wasn't just the judge and attorneys in the room. There were a few observers, law clerks, a court reporter, a couple of people waiting for their own cases. They watched quietly as Michael spoke, noting his tone, his ease, the way he seemed to dominate the space. Some pitied Emily, others barely noticed her at all. Michael noticed everything. He noticed how people's eyes followed him when he spoke, how they nodded slightly, unconsciously aligning with his authority. He noticed how Emily seemed to fade into the background, her presence so understated it was almost invisible. That pleased him more than he cared to admit. At one point, the judge asked Emily if she wished to make any statement before the proceedings concluded. Emily paused. The pause stretched just long enough for Michael to glance at her, eyebrows raised, a faint smirk tugging at the corner of his mouth. He expected nothing. Maybe a P or light sentence. Maybe gratitude. Maybe resignation. Instead, Emily said quietly, "No, Your Honor, I have nothing to add." Michael exhaled through his nose, amused. He leaned slightly toward his attorney and whispered, "Told you." His attorney didn't respond. He was focused on the documents in front of him, flipping through pages with a carefulness Michael found unnecessary. The case was already won. As the judge reviewed the final paperwork, Michael's thoughts drifted. He imagined how this moment would look in retrospect, how cleanly he had cut ties, how decisively he had acted. He felt justified, not just in ending the marriage, but in the way he had framed it. In his mind, he was the rational one, the provider, the one who had given opportunities. He glanced at Emily again. She stood exactly where she had been since the beginning. Same posture, same calm expression. But something about it irritated him now, not because she was emotional, but because she wasn't. He had expected at least a flicker of regret, some visible sign that this meant more to her than she let on. That absence unsettled him, though he refused to acknowledge it. The judge cleared his throat. "Before I finalize this," he said, "I want to confirm that both parties understand the implications of this agreement." Michael nodded immediately. "Absolutely." Emily nodded as well. Michael couldn't help himself. He spoke again, his voice casual, almost playful. "It's pretty straightforward, Your Honor. We're just two people moving on. Clean break." The judge studied him for a moment longer than necessary. His expression remained neutral, but his eyes lingered, as if measuring something beneath the surface. Michael mistook that look for routine scrutiny. Emily's attorney stood then. "Your Honor," he said, "with the court's permission, we would like to submit one final item into the record." Michael's head turned sharply. "One final item?" he repeated, unable to keep the surprise out of his voice. The judge nodded. "Go ahead." Emily's attorney walked forward and placed a sealed envelope on the judge's desk. It wasn't thick, it wasn't dramatic, but its presence shifted the energy in the room in a way Michael couldn't immediately explain. "What's that?" Michael asked, half smiling, half annoyed. "A clarification," the attorney replied calmly. Michael laughed. "Clarification of what?" "She already said she's not contesting anything." Emily remained silent. The judge opened the envelope and scanned the first page. His brow furrowed slightly. He turned the page, then another. The room grew quiet again, but this time the silence felt different, heavy, focused. Michael watched the judge closely now. He noticed the subtle change, the way the judge leaned back slightly, the way his fingers paused on the paper. A flicker of something crossed his face. Surprise, perhaps, or concern. Michael felt a brief tightening in his chest. "Is there a problem?" he asked, trying to keep his tone light. The judge didn't answer immediately. He continued reading. Emily's attorney returned to his seat without a word. Michael shifted uncomfortably. For the first time since entering the courtroom, he felt something he hadn't expected to feel: uncertainty. He told himself it was nothing, a technical issue, some minor formality. But the way the judge looked up slowly, deliberately, suggested otherwise. Michael glanced at Emily again, searching her face for clues. She met his gaze briefly. Her expression hadn't changed, still calm, still unreadable, but there was something else now. Not triumph, not pity, certainty. And suddenly, Michael realized something that made his stomach drop. This wasn't over, not even close. The judge stared at the documents for several seconds without speaking. It was not the casual pause of someone skimming routine paperwork. It was the kind of silence that suggested a weight had just been placed on his desk, something he needed to handle carefully. Michael tried to laugh it off, but his laugh came out thinner than before. "Your Honor," he said, attempting a confident tone, "is this really necessary? We already agreed on everything." The judge didn't respond to the attempt at charm. He set the papers down, adjusted his glasses again, and looked directly at Emily's attorney. "Counsel," the judge said, "you are submitting verification of identity and beneficiary status." "Yes, Your Honor," the attorney replied. His voice was steady. Professional, almost detached, like a man stating a simple fact. Michael blinked. "Beneficiary status?" he repeated under his breath, as if the words didn't belong in the same room as his divorce. The judge turned his gaze to Emily. "Mrs. Hayes," he said, "is the information in these documents accurate?" Emily didn't hesitate. "Yes, Your Honor." Michael's smile flickered. For the first time, his confident expression faltered, replaced by a look of mild irritation. "Can someone explain what's happening?" Michael asked, glancing at his own attorney as if expecting him to end this nonsense quickly. His attorney's face had tightened. He wasn't smiling anymore. He leaned forward slightly, eyes fixed on the judge's desk. The judge took a slow breath and spoke in a measured tone, as though choosing each word with care. "Mr. Hayes," he said, "it appears there is significant information related to your spouse's legal and financial standing that has not previously been addressed in these proceedings." Michael scoffed. "My spouse's financial standing?" He turned to Emily, incredulous. "She doesn't have financial standing." Emily said nothing. The judge continued. "These documents indicate that Mrs. Hayes is the sole beneficiary of an entity known as the Sinclair Trust." The name meant nothing to Michael. He shrugged as if it were irrelevant. "Okay, a trust. So what? People have trusts." Emily's attorney spoke for the first time since submitting the envelope. "Your Honor, if I may clarify, the Sinclair Trust is not a typical family trust. It is a multinational holding structure controlling a private network of assets, subsidiaries, and accounts." Michael laughed again, louder this time, forcing it. "Are we seriously doing this right now?" But the courtroom wasn't laughing with him. The court reporter's hands had slowed. One of the clerks had stopped moving altogether. A couple of observers leaned forward subtly, sensing the shift. Even Michael's attorney looked uneasy, as though he had suddenly realized he was standing on ground that wasn't solid. The judge lifted the top page and read a line silently, then looked back up. "Mr. Hayes," he said, "these filings place the estimated valuation of the Sinclair Trust at approximately $1.2 trillion. For a moment, Michael didn't react. Not because he was calm, but because his brain couldn't process the sentence. The number didn't fit into his understanding of reality. It was too large, too absurd, too impossible. He blinked again. Once, twice. Then he laughed, a sharp, disbelieving sound. That's not real. That's a typo." The judge's expression didn't change. "It is not a typo." Michael turned to his attorney, his voice rising. "Tell him this is a mistake." His attorney swallowed, eyes still on the documents. "Michael," he said quietly, I don't think it is." The word think hit Michael harder than the number. His attorney wasn't denying it. He wasn't rejecting it. He was hesitating. Michael's chest tightened. He looked back at Emily, searching her face desperately now. "Emily," he said, lowering his voice, as if this was suddenly private despite the courtroom full of witnesses. "What is this?" Emily held his gaze. Her eyes were calm, but there was no warmth there anymore. "It's true," she said. Michael shook his head, almost violently. No, it can't be. You're a teacher. You drive that old car. Emily's expression didn't shift. "I chose that life." Michael's mouth opened, then closed again. His face flushed, anger mixing with confusion, humiliation mixing with disbelief. He glanced around the room and realized people were watching him differently now, not admiringly, not sympathetically. They were watching as if he were the fool. The judge spoke again, voice still controlled but now tinged with warning. "Mr. Hayes, you should understand that this disclosure changes the context of the agreement you have just signed." Michael snapped back, desperate to regain control. "How? The papers are the papers. We agreed." She said she wasn't claiming anything. Emily's attorney responded calmly. "Correct. She is not claiming anything from him. She is merely ensuring the court is aware that she is not financially dependent and that no spousal support is required or requested." Michael stared at him. "So, she's rich," he said, as if saying it out loud would make it ridiculous again. "And she's just fine with leaving." Emil. Wise attorney didn't answer. He didn't need to. The answer was already unfolding in front of everyone. Michael turned back to Emily, voice cracking now despite his effort to keep it steady. "Why didn't you tell me?" Emily's reply was simple. "You never asked." Michael's jaw clenched. "Of course I didn't ask," he hissed. Who expects their wife to be... He stopped, because he couldn't find the words. He couldn't say trillionaire without sounding insane. Emily's face remained composed, but her voice sharpened slightly for the first time. "You assumed," she said. "You assumed everything about me. You assumed I was beneath you. You assumed I needed you." Michael's eyes widened. He glanced at the judge again, then at his attorney, then back at Emily, his thoughts scrambling for an escape route. "Your Honor," Michael said suddenly, turning to the bench, "I want to... I didn't have this information. I want to revisit the agreement." The judge's gaze hardened. "Mr. Hayes," he said, "you signed voluntarily, under oath, confirming that you understood the agreement and its consequences. Unless there is evidence of fraud or coercion, the court has no basis to reopen the settlement simply because you have learned something you failed to inquire about." Michael's throat tightened. "Fraud?" he repeated, pointing toward Emily. "She hid this. That's fraud." Emily's attorney stood slightly, voice still calm but firm. "Your Honor, Mrs. Hayes did not misrepresent anything. In these proceedings. She did not claim poverty. She did not request support. She simply did not disclose private family matters that were irrelevant to the requested outcome. Mr. Hayes never asked, and Mrs. Hayes never used her status to manipulate him." Michael's hands began to shake. He tried to hide it by clenching them into fists. The judge looked down at the documents one last time. "Mr. Hayes," he said, "the divorce is being finalized as submitted." Michael's breath caught. "Wait." The judge raised a hand, cutting him off. "In addition," the judge continued, "the court acknowledges that Mrs. Hayes is independently supported and requires no assistance from Mr. Hayes. This matter is concluded." The gavel struck. The sound echoed like a gunshot. Michael sat frozen, staring at the table in front of him, as if the words on the paper had transformed into something poisonous. Just minutes ago he had been smirking, mocking, certain. Now he couldn't even swallow. Emily didn't celebrate. She didn't smile. She simply turned slightly, as if preparing to leave. Michael watched her, panic rising. "Emily," he said quickly, standing up. "Emily, wait. We need to talk." Emily stopped for half a second. She didn't look back. When she finally spoke, her voice was low, but every word landed cleanly. "We already did," she said. "For 7 years. You just never listened." And then she walked away, leaving Michael standing in the middle of the courtroom with the entire world, watching him realize all at once that he had just signed away the one thing he never thought he could lose, his own control. Michael remained standing long after Emily had walked out of the courtroom. The space around him felt suddenly vast and hostile, as if the walls themselves had shifted outward, leaving him exposed. Conversations resumed quietly around him, lawyers whispering, clerks organizing files, people moving on to the next case. But every sound felt distant, muffled, unreal. It was as if the world had continued without waiting for him to catch up. His attorney touched his arm lightly. "Michael," he said, keeping his voice low, "we should go." Michael didn't respond at first. His eyes were fixed on the empty spot where Emily had stood moments earlier. He replayed her words over and over in his mind. "You never asked." The simplicity of the sentence haunted him more than the number ever could. $1.2 trillion. The figure still didn't feel real, but the humiliation did. As he finally turned and walked out of the courtroom, he felt eyes on him. Not the respectful glances he was used to, not the subtle admiration he often received in professional spaces. These were different. Curious, knowing. Some were sympathetic, others openly judgmental. He imagined what they were thinking. He imagined how the story would sound when retold. Outside, the hallway felt too bright, too loud. Michael loosened his tie, suddenly struggling to breathe comfortably. His attorney tried to speak again, but Michael raised a hand, silencing him. "I need a minute," Michael said. He leaned against the wall, palms flat against the cold surface. His thoughts raced, scrambling for logic, for justification, for a way to reframe what had just happened. He told himself Emily had deceived him, that she had withheld critical information, that any reasonable person would have done the same thing he did. But the harder he tried to convince himself, the more fragile the story became. She hadn't lied. She hadn't asked for anything. She hadn't even fought him. She had simply let him speak, let him assume, let him expose himself. The realizer. Son settled in slowly, painfully. He hadn't been outplayed by clever manipulation. He had been undone by his own arrogance. Over the next few days, the fallout began to spread. At first, it was subtle. A colleague sent him a message asking if he was okay. Another made a joke that didn't quite land. Someone forwarded him a vague article about high-profile divorce cases that mentioned no names but carried an unmistakable tone. Then the calls started. Friends who hadn't spoken to him in months suddenly wanted to check in. Former co-workers asked oddly specific questions about trusts and inheritance. People he barely knew hinted that they had heard something surprising. Michael realized the story was moving faster than he could control it. At work, the atmosphere shifted. Meetings felt different. Conversations stopped when he entered rooms. A senior partner pulled him aside one afternoon, choosing his words carefully. "We're getting some attention," he said. "Nothing official, but you should be aware." Aware of what? Michael wanted to ask. Aware that everyone now knew he was the man who divorced a trillionaire without realizing it. Aware that his judgment, once trusted, once respected, was now a punchline. The shame crept in quietly, then all at once. Michael began replaying years of conversations, moments he had dismissed, comments he had made casually. The jokes, the assumptions, the way he had spoken about Emily as if she was small. He remembered the way she listened. Ed, when he talked about himself. The way she never interrupted. The way she never bragged. What he had once seen as emptiness now revealed itself as restraint. Meanwhile, Emily disappeared completely. No statements, no interviews, no public acknowledgement of what had happened. That silence, once ignored, now felt deafening. It became part of the narrative. Mysterious, controlled, dignified. People admired it. Michael, on the other hand, couldn't escape his own reactions. Every attempt to explain himself sounded defensive. Every justification made him look worse. He began avoiding social events. He stopped answering calls. He spent nights awake staring at the ceiling, wondering how he had misjudged someone so completely. One evening, alone in his apartment, Michael poured himself a drink he didn't really want. He sat on the couch and stared at his phone, scrolling through old photos. Vacations he had considered modest. Dinners he barely remembered. Emily smiling softly in the background of his life, never demanding attention, never insisting on recognition. He thought about the moment in the courtroom when he had mocked her, the casual cruelty of it, the confidence with which he believed he was above her. That memory burned. For the first time, Michael felt something he hadn't allowed himself to feel in years, regret, not for losing money. He had never had access to it anyway, but for losing the chance to know the person he had dismissed, for mistaking power for worth, or assuming silence meant absence. He tried once to contact her. He typed a message, erased it, typed another. Nothing sounded right. Everything felt too late. He never sent anything. Emily moved on without him, untouched by the chaos he was drowning in. Her life didn't need to change because she had never built it on appearances. Michael's had. As days turned into weeks, one truth became impossible to avoid. The courtroom hadn't exposed Emily's secret. It had exposed his character, and that realization followed him everywhere, heavier than any number, louder than any headline, impossible to outrun. Emily had learned long before she met Michael that power did not announce itself. Growing up as Robert Sinclair's daughter meant living in the shadow of something vast, something deliberately hidden. Her father's wealth was never discussed at dinner tables, never displayed in jewelry or cars, never used as leverage in conversations. Instead, it existed quietly, protected by layers of anonymity and legal distance. From a young age, Emily understood that money, when visible, attracted the wrong kind of attention. When invisible, it offered freedom. Robert Sinclair was a man who believed that true control came from being underestimated. He taught Emily to observe rather than perform, to listen rather than dominate. The loudest person in the room, he once told her, is rarely the one with real power. Those words stayed with her, shaping how she moved through the world. She learned to dress simply, to speak carefully, to never volunteer information that didn't need to be shared. Not because she was afraid, but because she valued privacy more than validation. When she chose to live an ordinary life, It wasn't an act of rebellion against her inheritance. It was a conscious decision to define herself outside of it. She became a teacher because she liked the work, not because she needed the salary. She drove an old car because it was reliable, not because she couldn't afford better. Every choice she made was intentional, grounded in the belief that a quiet life was a protected one. Michael never saw that. He saw absence where there was restraint. He saw simplicity where there was discipline. In his world, value had to be visible to count. Titles mattered. Numbers mattered. Recognition mattered. If something couldn't be measured or admired, it might as well not exist. That difference defined their marriage more than either of them realized. Michael built his identity on momentum. Each promotion fed the next. Each success demanded acknowledgement. He spoke about power as something earned through visibility, through proving yourself again and again. Emily listened, not because she lacked opinions, but because she didn't need to compete. She had already seen what unchecked ambition could do to people. She had grown up around men who chased more even when they had everything. She had watched how it hollowed them out. There were moments when she considered, read telling Michael the truth, not for validation, but to bridge the gap between them. Each time she hesitated, not because she was hiding something shameful, but because she sensed how it would change the dynamic. She knew that once the information existed, it would define how he saw her, and she wanted to be loved without it. Michael never created space for that kind of vulnerability. He asked questions that assumed answers. He listened selectively. He measured contribution in ways that excluded everything Emily offered. Over time, she realized that even if she spoke, he wouldn't hear her. Not really. When the marriage began to fracture, Emily felt sadness but not surprise. The distance between them hadn't appeared overnight. It had been growing quietly, fed by assumptions and unexamined beliefs. When Michael decided to leave, she didn't resist. Not because she didn't care, but because she understood something he didn't. That holding on to someone who only valued appearances was a losing battle. The courtroom became the place where those two worldviews finally collided. Emily didn't reveal the truth to punish Michael. She didn't do it to reclaim power or seek revenge. She did it because accuracy mattered. The court needed to know she was independent, that she was not vulnerable, that she did not require protection or provision. It was a factual correction, nothing more. Michael interpreted it as betrayal because it shattered the narrative he had built around himself. In his mind, he was the provider, the successful one, the man with leverage. Learning that his wife had always existed outside that hierarchy didn't just embarrass him, it invalidated the foundation of his self-image. For Emily, the moment wasn't triumphant, it was clarifying. It confirmed what she had sensed for years, that Michael valued the idea of power more than its substance, that he respected status more than character, that he mistook silence for weakness because he had never learned to sit comfortably with it. After the divorce, Emily returned to the life she had chosen: quiet mornings, purposeful work, private routines. The wealth attached to her name remained where it had always been, managed, distant, unobtrusive. It did not rush into her life to compensate for loss. It didn't need to. Michael's world, by contrast, felt suddenly unstable. The structures he relied on, reputation, perception, admiration, proved fragile once exposed to scrutiny. He began to understand too late that power built on comparison collapses the moment the comparison shifts. Emily never reached out to explain herself. She didn't owe anyone a narrative. The truth had spoken for itself. Those who understood it didn't need elaboration. Those who didn't never would. In the end, the greatest divide between them was not money or status, but awareness. Emily had always known who she was, with or without her inheritance. Michael had defined himself by what he appeared to have, never questioning hat lay beneath. The courtroom hadn't revealed a secret fortune. It had revealed two philosophies of life standing face to face, and only one of them had been grounded in something that lasted. There was no single headline that captured what had really happened in that courtroom. People reduced it to a spectacle, a punchline, a shocking statistic meant to provoke disbelief. They focused on the number because it was easier than confronting the truth beneath it. $1 trillion sounded absurd, unreal, almost fictional. But the real story had never been about money. It had been about perception, and how easily people confuse visibility with value. Michael had lived his life believing that worth was something you proved outwardly. He believed success announced itself, that power demanded recognition, that respect was earned through dominance. Every choice he made reinforced that belief. He spoke loudly, he asserted himself, he measured people by what they could show. And because the world often rewards confidence, no one had ever forced him to question it. Emily existed outside that framework entirely. She understood something Michael never had the patience to learn, that strength doesn't need validation. That silence is not the absence of power, but often its concealment. She did not perform success because she did not need approval. She did not explain herself because explanation invites judgment. And she did not reveal her inheritance because it would have distorted every interaction she had. What happened in the courtroom wasn't a reversal of fortune. It was a correction of assumptions. Michael assumed that because Emily lived modestly, she was dependent. He assumed that because she didn't argue, she had nothing to say. He assumed that because she didn't compete, she had already lost. Each assumption felt logical to him, reinforced by a world that celebrates visibility and equates noise with influence. The moment those assumptions collapsed, so did the identity built on them. Humiliation, in its purest form, is not public embarrassment. It is the sudden realization that the story you told yourself about who you are is wrong, that the hierarchy you relied on was imaginary, that the confidence you mistook for insight was actually ignorance. Michael didn't just lose face that day. He lost the framework through which he understood himself. Emily, meanwhile, gained nothing she didn't already have. That is what made the contrast so striking. She did not rise, he fell. She did not change, his world did. Her power had never depended on the courtroom's acknowledgement. It existed regardless of who believed in it. The lesson unsettled people because it challenged a comforting lie, that you can always identify strength by how it looks, that those who appear quiet are behind, that simplicity signals lack. The story forced observers to confront how often they make the same judgments Michael did, how often they dismiss what they don't immediately recognize. It asked an uncomfortable question. How many Emilys have been underestimated because they didn't perform power in familiar ways? How many Michaels have mistaken confidence for depth and control for character? True power rarely announces itself. It doesn't need to intimidate or impress. It doesn't rush to correct misconceptions because it is not threatened by them. It waits, it observes, and when clarity is required, it speaks once, precisely. Emily's choice not to fight was not surrender. It was selectivity. She did not need to win an argument to be right. She needed only to ensure the truth existed where it mattered. After that, she stepped away, unburdened by the need to explain herself to people who had already decided who she was. Michael's downfall was not that he mocked his wife. It was that he never questioned why he felt entitled to. He never examined the belief that value must be visible to be real. He never considered that the people he overlooked might be choosing invisibility, not suffering from it. The courtroom did not create the imbalance between them. It revealed it. In the aftermath, observers debated whether Emily should have told him earlier, whether withholding the truth was fair. But fairness assumes obligation, and obligation requires respect. Emily had no obligation to correct assumptions she never invited. Michael had every opportunity to ask, to listen, to see her as more than a reflection of his own importance. He chose not to. That joy. CE was the real verdict. Stories like this linger because they strike a nerve. They remind people that arrogance often wears the mask of certainty, and that certainty without curiosity is dangerous. They expose how easily people reduce others to roles, labels, and appearances. And they suggest, quietly but firmly, that the most powerful people in the room are often the ones no one is watching. In the end, Michael lost control because he believed he already had it. Emily kept hers because she never needed to prove it. That difference is not just the heart of this story, it is the warning hidden inside it. Because the next time someone underestimates silence, dismisses simplicity, or mocks restraint, they might not be facing weakness at all. They might be standing in front of power that simply hasn't introduced itself yet. Weeks after the hearing, Michael still heard the sound of the gavel in his head. It showed up at strange times, while he stood in the shower, while he sat in traffic, while he stared at his laptop pretending to work. It wasn't the literal sound that haunted him, it was what it represented. The moment everything he thought he knew snapped into a different shape, people around him eventually moved on because that's what people do. They found new stories, new scandals, new headlines to talk about. The jokes became less frequent, the whispers faded. But for Michael, the silence that followed was worse than the noise. Without the public reaction to blame, he was as left alone with himself, alone with the uncomfortable truth that the courtroom had not destroyed his life. His own blind certainty had. He tried to rebuild the story in a way that made him feel less foolish. At first he told himself Emily had tricked him, that she had hidden the truth intentionally to make him look small, that she had set a trap and he had stepped into it. But the more he replayed the timeline, the weaker that explanation became. Emily hadn't provoked him. She hadn't pushed him. She hadn't even defended herself. She had only stood still while he spoke, letting his own words do the damage. That realization forced him into a place he hated, self-reflection. He remembered the early days of their marriage, the way Emily would listen quietly while he talked about deals and promotions. He had assumed she was impressed. Now he wondered if she had simply been patient. He remembered how she would suggest small, practical changes to his lifestyle. Slower mornings, fewer late nights, more time away from constant competition. He had dismissed those suggestions as weakness. Now he saw them differently, as wisdom he had been too loud to hear. He thought about the phrase he had used in court. She doesn't own anything of value. The arrogance of it made him feel physically sick. Not because the statement had been wrong on paper, but because of what it revealed about him. He had defined value so narrowly that he could look at a human being, someone who had shared his life for 7 years, and reduce her to a number, an asset sheet, a visible contribution. Emily had never asked for credit for the things she did. She had been the one who remembered birthdays, kept the household running, smoothed over conflicts with his family, carried the emotional weight when he was too busy to notice. Michael had called it nothing. Because it wasn't loud, because it wasn't profitable, because it didn't come with a title. The truth was that Emily had been strong in ways he didn't respect, because he didn't understand them. On the other side of the city, Emily continued living the life she had always chosen. She returned to her classroom, she corrected homework, she attended meetings, she smiled politely at co-workers who had no idea what her last name meant in hidden rooms across the world. The wealth attached to her identity remained protected behind structures most people would never see, and she treated it like background noise. But she did make one change, not the kind the public would expect. Not a mansion, not a private jet, not a headline-grabbing gesture. She started a scholarship fund at her school, quietly. No press release, no branding. It covered lunches for kids whose parents were struggling. It paid for books. It funded after-school programs. She didn't put her name on a plaque. She didn't ask for applause. She simply made the world slightly better in the way she always had, without performance. Michael would never know the details of what she did. He wasn't part of her life anymore. That was the point. There were moments when he wanted to reach out, not to ask for anything, he understood how pathetic that would be, but to apologize, to tell her he finally saw what he had missed. Yet every time he drafted a message it sounded wrong. Too late, too self-centered, too focused on relieving his guilt rather than honoring her boundaries. So he didn't send anything. And in that silence, he finally understood something Emily had known all along. Sometimes the most respectful thing you can do is accept that you are not owed another chance. Months passed. Michael's career recovered in small ways. He found work again, though not at the same level. He attended meetings with less swagger. He spoke with more caution. He learned to read rooms instead of dominating them. People assumed he had matured. They didn't know the deeper truth, that he had been stripped down by a moment he could never undo. He carried that lesson like a scar, invisible but permanent. The story, when told by outsiders, always emphasized the twist, the secret heiress, the $1 trillion trust, the husband who mocked and signed. But that was only the surface. The real twist was quieter and far more common. A man underestimated someone he claimed to love because he believed his perspective was the only one that mattered. And in the end, it wasn't Emily's wealth that made him small. It was Emily's composure, because she had walked into that courtroom with something he didn't have: clarity. She knew who she was with, or without anyone's approval. She didn't need to win. She didn't need to explain. She didn't need to punish. She simply needed to be free of someone who could not see her beyond his own ego. That is what made the ending so final. Not the gavel, not the paperwork, not the number on a trust. The ending was final because Emily left the courtroom the same way she had lived her entire life: quiet, controlled, and untouchable. Michael stayed behind with the one thing he could never sign away or divorce from: the knowledge that he had mistaken silence for weakness, and the unsettling truth that the most dangerous thing a person can do is laugh at what they don't understand, right up until the moment reality corrects them.